Hello. Well, we've got only 44 minutes worth of time left on our video, so our class will be 44 minutes long today. Let's look at the investigations. The first place I want to look with you is on page 3, the preface. It's a famous preface for a couple of reasons. But one of the things in the second paragraph, the second half of the second paragraph, he says that I couldn't write an extended book. What we have is vignettes, a book of short propositions and short paragraphs, kind of like the way Nietzsche wrote as well, and some other thinkers. He says, but this is connected with the very nature of the investigation, for it compels us to travel crisscross in every direction over a wide field of thought. The philosophical remarks in this book are, as it were, a number of sketches of landscapes, famous metaphor of landscapes, which were made in the course of these long and meandering journeys. So if you're really you want to get familiar with something, you go over the landscape in different ways and look at it from different perspectives and so on. And that's what he's doing with language, and especially with the key aspects of language, with the grammar and the key terminology that cause the greatest confusion, as we saw in our last class. He's trying to untangle human beings. They're entangled all unknowing in the net of language. Then on page 4, there's another famous statement, the third last paragraph. He says, I make these reflections public with misgivings. It is not impossible that they should fall to the lot of this work in the poverty and darkness of this time to bring light into one brain or another. But of course, it's not likely. Now, the Second World War was going on just before he wrote this, probably, and the nuclear weapons had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During the war, Wittgenstein had volunteered in Britain to help with the war effort, and he had volunteered his time for that. But he also is thinking of the 20th century itself. It isn't just the wars of the 20th century, but the terrible poverty and darkness that human beings spiritually are living in when they're complicit and they work in these giant projects which are so destructive of the environment, destructive of human life through militarism and so on. To him, human beings, were in need of awakening, very much in need of awakening. And we'll see some aspects of how he's trying to do that later on when we get further on in the investigations. So let's look at the beginning of the book. Number 1, it's on page 5, but it's item number 1. He gives the quotation in Latin from St. Augustine's Confessions, and that's translated at the bottom of the page. And St. Augustine is basically saying that when he was a child, from his recollection, when he was a child, when he learned language, it was a matter of adults pointing at things. That's a chair, that's a dog, this is a glass of wine, this is your fork, this is a knife. He learned language by ostensive definitions. St. Augustine thinks. And then Wittgenstein responds to that in the second paragraph. These words, he says, it seems to me, give us a particular picture of the essence of human language. It is this: words in language name objects. Sentences are combinations of such names. In this picture of language, we find the roots of the following idea. Every word has a meaning, and this meaning is correlated with the word. It is the object for which the word stands. Augustine does not mention any difference between kinds of words. Someone who describes the learning of language in this way is, I believe, thinking of nouns like table, chair, bread, and other people's names. And secondly, the names of certain actions and properties, red, blue, green, sounds, and so on. And the remaining kinds of words, they assume, just kind of take care of themselves. Like say, this book is red, and this takes care of itself in some way. Is takes care of itself, and you've got the two naming qualities, book and red, somehow give the sentence meaning. St. Augustine thinks. Now think of the following use of language, Wittgenstein says. I send someone shopping. I give him a slip of paper marked 5 red apples. He takes the slip to the shopkeeper, who opens a drawer marked apples. And then he looks up the word red in a chart and finds a color sample next to it. And then he says a series of elementary number words. I assume that he knows them by heart, up to the word 5. For each number word, he takes an apple of the same color as the color sample out of the drawer. It is in this and similar ways that one operates with words. But how does he know where and how is he to look up the word red? And how does he know what to do with the word 5? Someone asks. Well, I assume that he acts as I have described. Explanations come to an end somewhere. But what is the meaning of the word 5? No such thing is in question here. Only how the word 5 was used. And in this example, a very famous example, we have the fundamentals of the new understanding of language that Wittgenstein is giving in the investigations. Like the Tractatus, the Investigations is a classic of philosophy which transformed thinking after it was published. And so you've got 5 red apples. And in the Tractatus view, in the picture theory of language, you've got the assumption that each of these names something in the world. Right? So that the meaning of each of these is reduced to something similar, to a kind of projection to a concatenation of objects in the world. And what Wittgenstein says here is, look, don't think abstractly. Let's look at how these are actually used. And it turns out that there's 3 different grammars, 3 different ways of acting in the world and using language that are entirely different from one another. All right? What we do with the word apples and the grammatical possibility of the word apples is very different from what we do with colors and the grammatical possibilities of the word color. And the way we use 5. And the questioner says, well, how does he know the meaning of the word 5? Nothing like that is even in question. He acts in a certain way, in a certain context, and the word 5 operates within that context. He doesn't have to be a mathematician knowing the meaning of something, or even somehow this has got to correspond to a meaning of something. He does as the conventions of his upbringing and the conventions of the society expect. And that's all that so you have 3 different giant differences, and Wittgenstein says we don't want to amalgamate them to one's theory of language, which reduces those differences. Let's look at the real way grammar is used. So in number 2 on page 6, he introduces the famous this idea of the builders, a primitive language in builders. Now, he's imagining a primitive language game. This doesn't mean, primitive in the sense of primitive peoples. Primitive here means simple, something very simple in order for us to be able to better understand language. So it's an arbitrary, artificial model here. So he says, let us imagine a language for which the description given by Augustine is correct. The language is meant to serve for communication between builder A and assistant B. A is building with building stones that are hard, blocks, pillars, slabs, and beams. B has to pass him the stones and do so in the order in which A needs them. For this purpose, they make use of a language consisting of the words block, pillar, slab, and beam. A calls out, A calls them out, B brings the stone, which he has learned to bring at such and such a call. Conceive of this as a complete primitive language. Okay, so we got these words, block, pillar, slab, and beam. A calls beam, B brings a beam. A calls slab, B brings a slab. Now notice what's going on here. First of all, there is no picture here of anything, unlike the Tractatus. Right? It isn't like you're saying, well, this has got to be a picture of something. This has got to have meaning by pointing to something. You have words, and the words obviously are nouns, slab, beam, and so on. Right? And it's not a matter of what is the meaning of slab and how does he know that what a slab is. It's a matter of B, integrated into this activity of the building. So bringing it over to A, integrating into this activity is the use of these noun words. So he yells out slab, and B gets the slab and brings it. Nothing is pictured whatsoever. B is not, it doesn't need a mental picture, thinking, here's the word, and he forms a mental image of something, and he assumes that he knows it because he's learned in a sense of definition of it and so on. None of that is necessary. It just works. That's the way human beings do things. So he then criticizes Augustine in number 3. Augustine, we might say, does describe a system of communication, only not everything we call language is in this system. And one has to say this in several cases where the question arises, what will that description do or not? Well, it will do, but only for a very narrowly circumscribed area. That is, the pointing, ostensive definitions, the pointing of nouns. It leaves out all the different uses, all the different dimensions of language, which are part, of which that is only a tiny part of grammar. So page 7, he talks about ostensive definitions, and in number 6, he's talking about the language of A and B, or the language of a tribe, or children who are brought up. He says, well, children would be brought up to perform those actions. Now, notice that the words are part of the actions. Right? The action that A is doing, he's calling out B. So the action of building and the action of bringing are integrated into the physical situation of beings and people moving them and so on. So he talks about the training. Obviously at some point when the system was being brought up, you had to point to the beam and say, well, this is a beam and that's a slab and so on. But notice what Wittgenstein says at the very bottom of page 7, the last new paragraph there. He says, but if this is the effect of the ostensive teaching, am I to say that it affects an understanding of the word? Doesn't someone who acts on the call slab in such a way understand it? They act properly. It means they understand it. I doubt if it was, no doubt it was the ostensive teaching that helped bring this about, but only together with a certain kind of instruction. With different instruction, the same ostensive teaching of the words would have affected a quite different understanding. They say you're an archaeologist, right, or a student of archaeology, and so you're in this ancient site, and you see beams and slabs and pillars, and you're using those words, right? And the words are integrated into the things you're looking at, right? But your action is entirely different, and so therefore your use of those words and the grammar of those words in this different kind of actions, the archaeological language game, the archaeological practice is entirely different from that of the builders. There's a relationship; they overlap, but they're not. There are differences, and so in the next paragraph, this is subsection 7, section 7, the second paragraph. We can also think of the whole process of using words as one of those games by which children learn their native language. I will call these language games, and will sometimes speak of a primitive language as a language game. And the process of naming the stones and repeating words after someone might also be called language games. Think of certain uses are made of words in games like ring-a-ring of roses. I shall also call the whole consisting of language and its activities into which it is woven the language game, a language game. Now there are 4 different definitions of language game here in this paragraph. Right? And they're all necessary to what he's talking about. But right there you have, so the question comes up, is there, and he'll talk about this later, as you know from having read it, what do all these use of the word games, there's 4 different kinds of language games here, what do they have in common? What do all games have in common? Are all games played on a board, moving pieces? No. Are all games played in competition with some opponent? And the realization here is that there is no essence to all games. There is no common feature to all games. And here we have a fundamental and famous central principle of the investigations. Right? There's no common feature or essence to any word or any concept. Quite different than what Plato said. Yes. So in the next paragraph, in number 8, he's adding more activities to the game of the builders, the language game of the builders, right? And he's talking. He brings in the language game of the shopkeeper, 5 red apples, and how these are different language games. And then at the end of that, section 9, on the next page, the last paragraph in section 9, he says, are there and this taught ostensibly? Imagine how one might perhaps teach their use. One will at places point at places and things, but in this case the pointing occurs in the use of words too, and not merely in learning use. And how do we learn words like there and this? Right? these are among the most abstract features of all language. Absolutely abstract. This applies to anything. And how do we learn these words? He said. It cannot be through extensive definition, but it's through a whole set of practices, a way of life, a form of life. And the meaning emerges within that set of practices. So in number 10, he says, now what do the words of this language signify? How is what they signify supposed to come out other than in the kind of use they have? And we have already described that. So the expression, this word signifies that, would have to become part of our description. In other words, the description ought to take the form the word X signifies. Well, one can abbreviate the description of the use of the word slab by saying that the word signifies this object. This will be done if, for example, it is merely a matter of removing the misunderstanding that the word slab refers to the building stone in which we actually call it a block. So there's a use for, pointing and signifying, the concept of signifying. The builder or the child is confused. The child says this is a slab, and you say, no, there's a slab over there. This is a block. Right? But notice what he says. He says, but the kind of referring this is, that is to say, the rest of the use of these words is already known. Right? So you can't clarify through extensive definition saying, this is a block and that's a slab. You can't clarify that unless you have language already known, unless you are able to say this is a X and use the extensive definition. So that's all part of language. It isn't as if you can just clarify without the language being already in operation. So then in the last paragraph in 10, he says, but making the descriptions of the uses of the words similar in this way cannot make the uses any more like one another. Right? In other words, there are many different kinds of uses, 5, bread, apples. And you can't reduce them to any simple way that they all somehow are meaningful, that all the words in language are somehow meaningful in some sort of theory of language. You'll see in John Searle's response to Wittgenstein in the video that you'll be watching. Searle says, why not? He says, I can't make a theory of language. Why not? Maybe we should make a theory of language. Well, maybe it's impossible for reasons that Searle might not comprehend. Then another famous metaphor in number 11. He says, think of tools in a toolbox. There is a hammer, the pliers, saw, a screwdriver, a ruler, a glue pot, glue, nails, and screws. The functions of words are as diverse as the functions of these objects. And in both cases, there are similarities. So, what is common to all tools? Would you say all tools serve to modify something? Wittgenstein says. But what does the ruler modify? If you take a ruler and you measure the width of the desk, what are you modifying there? As a matter of fact, there is no essence to all tools. I might have some need to pound something with this, right? I'm pounding. There you have a tool in use. What does he ask? Do all tools have some operation in the world? but now you're just becoming trivial. If you know, it's like saying, Wittgenstein says, it's like saying all words are words. What is in common with all colors? What does it makes them colors? It's there's got to be something there, right? But maybe there's not. You know, Wittgenstein says we use the word color. We use the word just like we use the word red or green or blue in all kinds of different ways. There isn't one essence that gives the meaning to these words. Right? It depends on how they're used in the complex interactions of human life. So over the page, he's got the famous metaphor of the toolbox, and then in number 12, another famous metaphor, the metaphor of the cabin of a locomotive. He says there are boundless, he says in 12, it is like looking into the cabin of a locomotive. There are handles there, all looking more or less alike. All these handles. This stands to reason, since they're all supposed to be handled. Right? They're all supposed to be used by a hand, a human hand. But one is the handle of a crank, which can be moved continuously. It regulates the opening of a valve. The other is the handle of a switch. It has only two operations. It is either on or off. The third is the handle of a brake lever. The harder one pulls on it, the harder the braking. A fourth, the handle of a pump. It has effect only so long as it is moved to and fro. So what is his point, right? The handles in the cabin of a locomotive are like words. Right? Words look all the same. Right? And these handles, you're looking at them, they look almost identical. They're just handles. But each one has an entirely different function. Right? So the sameness is an illusion. What is it that all handles have in common? Well, this could be a handle for something, like this book. Right? And what is it that all words have in common? Nothing. They have nothing in common. On 13, he makes the point that I just made. If we say every word in the language signifies something, we have so far said nothing whatsoever, unless we explain exactly what distinction we wish to make. It's like, it might be, of course, that we wanted to distinguish the words of a language from words without meaning, such as occur in Lewis Carroll's poems, words like tra-la-la in a song. But if you say, in the concrete situation, if you want to say, what is going on in Lewis Carroll's nonsense poems is not language, right? You make that claim. You might then say, well, then what is the difference between that and language? And you say, well, language, every word signifies something, right? So in that context, it makes sense. But if you are just trying to explain the essence of language outside of a particular context and a particular limited role for what you're saying, then it's just empty. It's like saying every word is a word. So in 14, he makes the point that I made. All tools, someone would say, all tools serve to modify something. So a hammer modifies the position of a nail, a saw the shape of a board, and so on. And what is modified by the ruler, or the glue pot, the nails? Our knowledge of a thing's length, the temperature of the glue, and the solidity of the box. Would anything be gained by assimilating the expressions in this way? They're really different. And there's no essence to all tools. There's no essence to all games. There's no essence to all handles. There's no essence to language. let's look then at number 16. Someone asks, yeah, in reading Wittgenstein, you have to pay attention to where there are quotation marks and so on, because in these aphorisms, he's got an interlocutor that he puts in there. So it isn't just Wittgenstein's opinion. Sometimes you've got people asking questions, sometimes you've got critical statements, and you be sure to pay attention to that, or else you'll think that must be Wittgenstein's opinion. So here he's got the question: what about the color samples that A.N. shows to be? Are they part of the language? In the 5 red apples example, right? So you've got someone coming with a slip, a language that says 5 red apples, and so the word red there, right? What does that refer to? And we saw that the shopkeeper takes out a color chart, and it has different colors, and he takes the root, he goes to the red, and so he has the red sample, and then he uses that to take out red apples and so on. So that's the question that's being answered. Wittgenstein answers, it's as you please. They do not belong to spoken language, obviously. Right? This doesn't belong to spoken language. The word red, R-E-D does, but this doesn't belong. But if I'm using this as a sample, what's the difference between red and blue? Well, this is blue, this is red. Right? Then are these samples part of language? Why not? He says, it is as you please. They do not belong to spoken language, but when I say to someone, pronounce the word the, you will also count the second the as part of the sentence. Yet it has a role just like that of the color sample in the language game. That is, it is a sample of what we want the other to say. So you're learning language. If someone says, pronounce the word indignato, and so you repeat indignato. And what's the difference between using that sound, right, as a sample and using this as a sample? 17. We could say in, how much time are we at?
12 minutes.
You could say in language 8, that he refers to in 8, that there are different kinds of words, where the functions of the word slab and the word block are more like than those of slab and D, for example. But how we group words into kinds will depend on the aim of the classification and on our own inclination. Think of different points of view according to which one can classify tools into different kinds of tools, or chess into different kinds of chess pieces. In other words, every projection can be done in some other way. And I remember an example from when my daughter was learning language when she was a little girl. And we were doing something like this. I was teaching her to count, I believe it was. And so I had this, and this, and this, and I gave examples. This was a book, and so I had a book here, and this was an apple, and so there were 2 apples in one book, and then So I'm saying, okay, what is this? And she says 1. And I say, what is this? And she says 2. What is this? She says 3. What is this? And she says 3. And that is the kind of thing that Wittgenstein is talking about, that there is no one-to-one correlation. There is no, any projection can be done in a different way. Right? So it isn't that there's some projection that can, insists that this is form. And it's the same in all areas. If you're teaching someone mathematics, you might say, okay, this plus this equals 4. This. Okay, and so then this plus this equals 6. Equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But then you say, okay. So suppose I add 2 each time, and so we've got 2, 4, and then the person you're talking to says, and that shows that this and this equals 6. So 2 plus 2 equals 6. Right? It's just a different projection. Now, there's some projections that may be similar, and there's some projections that are so fundamental to human life that we don't really question them, right? And usually the number groups are like that, right? They're so integral to human life, to the conventions of human life, that we just automatically do that. We don't make those kind of mistakes. But the projection is not something, Wittgenstein's point is, the projection is not something that is derived from an independent reality outside of the conventional uses of the grammar. So that anything, and that's what broke the hold of the Tractatus on him too. That in the Tractatus, remember, he's got the language. Right? The red book is on the table. And this has got to have a meaning, which is true or false, so there's got to be, in logical space, these words have got to refer to elements of logical space, and the sense of this sentence has to be something that can be true or false in logical space. But he's assuming that there's only one projection, right? And he says that, remember? He's assuming that the inner form here, right, the propositional form that he calls it, the inner relationship of naming and sense, he's assuming that projects onto a world out there, logical space. But any projection can be done differently, right? Any projection can be interpreted differently. And therefore, as soon as you realize that there's no way that we can characterize the world that can't be characterized differently, projected differently onto the world, it breaks the conceptual hold of the one possible way of looking at it. And now you've got the multiplicity of projections that are part of the language games by which we use language. 19. It is easy to imagine a language consisting only of orders and reports in battle, or a language consisting only of questions and expressions for answering yes and no, and countless other things, he says. And to imagine a language is to imagine a form of life. Now here's where he introduces another fundamental. Notice what we've got here. We've got language games, primitive language games, and now we got the introduction of a concept fundamental to his later philosophy, a form of life. And so you can imagine language of only the question expressions, of countless other things. A form of life means you've got a whole complex society living that live within what is phenomenology. Not Wittgenstein. Maybe once or twice he used it this way, but phenomenology calls it the Lebensfeld, the life world. And so there's a life world, a set of assumptions, a set of practices, a set of people doing the things of life, getting food and processing the food and eating it and all the rest of it. All of this is part of a form of life. And so within, and if you simplify this to very primitive levels, you can imagine all kinds of ways of using the words yes or no, language games with yes or no, language games with builders and so on. They don't reduce to any one way of looking at it. But what about this? Is the call slab in example 2 a sentence or a word? Now he's introducing another dimension of the issue here. If a word surely it has not the same meaning as the like-sounding word in the ordinary language. Or in number 2, it is a call. But if a sentence, it is surely not the elliptical sentence, slab, in our language. As far as the first question goes, you call a slab a word and also a sentence. Perhaps it could be aptly called a degenerate sentence, as one speaks of a degenerate hyperbola. In fact, it is our elliptical sentence. But that is surely only a shortened form of the sentence, bring me a slab. This is, the Laffer would say this. And there is no such sentence in example 2. But why should I conversely have called the sentence, bring me a slab, a lengthening of the sentence slab? Because someone who calls out slab really means bring me a slab. But how do you do this? How do you mean that while saying slab? How do you mean that while saying slab? Do you say the unshortened sentence to yourself secretly? Someone says slab, and I say he means bring me a slab. And why should I translate the call slab into a different expression in order to say what someone means by it? Right? So when someone says slab and I bring it, why do I have to translate it into bring me a slab? 1 minute. And so notice this, that slab, human beings acting in the world, and when they say slab and the builder's assistant brings the slab, that's sufficient language, right? That's a sentence. We don't need to, look at a grammar book. What we see is that meaning operates here. Meaning is integrated within that activity, that human activity, which also is within a form of life, and so meaning is generated by that situation. You don't need to assume that there's a sentence there called bring me a slab or something of that nature. Okay, we'll stop there, and next time we'll pick up we'll pick up right where we left off. There on page 12, subsection number 20.